Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines series, sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video we're going to be covering a controversial topic: what is privilege? Now in this video we're going to discuss what is sometimes called social privilege. It should be noted that this is not the same as the term privilege, which is often contrasted with a right, as in the question of whether voting is a right or a privilege. Rather, this is the privilege of white privilege, male privilege, or check your privilege. This is a very contentious topic, and I understand covering it, even in a relatively impartial way, may lose me some subscribers. I encourage you to watch the end of the video before commenting and to try to use the definitions and terminology that I supply here to make your debate more nuanced instead of just yelling back and forth with your preconceived notions, all right? There are going to be a range of empirical claims that I'm going to mention because they are a part of the debate around privilege. As a skeptic, I'm not going to defend them. I doubt them all. I doubt that I exist. But I need to use them and talk about them to illustrate the concepts. As an indirect skeptic, I step into the shoes of someone to show that some of their ideas may be flawed. So, with all that out of the way, we're going to try here to offer a definition of privilege and then discuss some of the sticking points that people have when debating this. So, the concept of social privilege comes from the realms of sociology and anthropology. However, as it's often used to make moral and political arguments, and some claim it carries normative requirements, a philosophical definition is required. This is surprisingly difficult to come by. No entry for either privilege or social privilege can be found in the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Oxford Companion to Philosophy, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Collier Macmillan, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I'm going to do my best to offer a definition here, but please feel free to give your critiques in the comments below if you think you have a better idea. So, with this in mind, I offer the following definition. Some characteristic C is considered to give privilege to individuals that possess that characteristic in a particular situation S, if and only if individuals who possess C are more likely to have a favorable outcome in situation S than individuals that do not possess C. So, broadly, when we're talking about characteristics, we're talking about a wide range of things. This could be anything from skin color to accent to IQ to wealth. The characteristic doesn't necessarily need to be inherent to a particular person. It can change over time. And the particular situation must be very, very specific in order for us to provide an actual explanation of whether or not that characteristic is correlated with better outcomes. Now, there is an interesting debate to be had around what constitutes actually a better outcome or a worse outcome, and what if people have different opinions on those. For now, we're not going to get into that debate around values right here. We're going to take that as generally people are going to agree, and we're only going to talk about the situations in which people agree for now, and save the debate around those things for later. All right. So to demonstrate exactly how this definition could work, we're going to use what is hopefully a minimally controversial example. Instantiate C as can see and S as when driving. So the characteristic is the ability to see, and S, the situation, is when you are driving. When driving, we might consider sight a privilege, as being able to see usually results in more favorable outcomes when driving than not being able to see. Hopefully that follows pretty intuitively. Note that this doesn't mean that everyone who cannot see will always have a worse result driving than everyone who can see. I might be briefly blinded by a flash of light, but still be able to pull safely off to the side of the road, while someone with perfect vision could easily swerve into oncoming traffic and die. Rather, the claim is that, on average, people who can see have better outcomes driving than people who cannot. Note also that this does not make a claim of causality. We're not saying that being able to see causes you to have worse outcomes on the road, though you might think there's a causal link there. Rather, that statistically people who can't see have worse outcomes regardless of the reasons. It should also be noted that we're not saying that this is a claim that holds regardless of what modal context you're in any possible world, or even in any time period within this world. We're saying at this moment, in this actual world, this is the case. With this in hand, let's look at some more controversial examples. One might make the claim that men are more likely to receive a higher sentence than women when convicted of the same crime. If this proves to be true, as some studies claim it does, one could say that in the situation of sentencing for criminal charges, being a woman would constitute a privilege. Furthermore, one might claim that being white makes one more likely to get hired when looking for a job, as once again, studies have claimed that this is the case. If this proves to be true, remember I'm a skeptic, so I'm doubting absolutely everything, including the truth of those studies, one could say that in the situation of searching for work, being white would constitute a privilege. Before anyone gets up in arms, I want to make a distinction between two things that are often meant by the term privilege. I'm going to steal a distinction from Kant to refer to these as hypothetical privilege and categorical privilege. The definition that I offered before is the definition of hypothetical privilege. That's privilege relative to a particular situation. Hypothetical in the sense of it says, if you are driving, then having sight is a privilege. It's not saying that having sight is always a privilege. If you are being sentenced, then it is a privilege to be a woman. It's not claiming that being a woman is always a privilege or always results in better outcomes. Categorical privilege, on the other hand, is the claim that a certain characteristic gives equal or more beneficial outcomes regardless of the situation. Note that this is not claiming that a particular characteristic provides privilege regardless of a time or possible world. Rather, that all situations at the current time in the actual world, that characteristic provides privilege. Okay? So hypothetical privilege has to do with a specific situation, whereas categorical privilege is making the claim that some characteristic gives equal or more beneficial outcomes regardless of the situation. Now that we've kind of outlined a few terms and things we're going to talk about, we're going to look at some sticking points and where disagreements arise, and whether our terminology and use of a little bit of nuance can resolve these disagreements. So there are a number of sticking points that can arise in conversations about privilege. Some people might doubt the antecedent of a hypothetical claim. One might claim that black people are just as likely to get hired as white people, or that men and women receive equal sentences for equal convictions. These are empirical claims, and if you believe in things like scientific realism, there are a range of experiments which have been conducted which purport to demonstrate them one way or the other. Whether or not those scientific claims have been proven sufficiently is not a discussion we're going to get into right here, because as I said, I'm a skeptic. I'm doubtful of scientific realism as a whole, so I'm going to set those aside. If that's the discussion you want to have, that's a discussion you need to have with the scientists and the philosophers of scientists that think we can underpin those scientific claims. However, setting those aside, another sticking point arises when one talks broadly of white privilege, straight privilege, Christian privilege, etc. This disagreement arises from an equivocation of hypothetical privilege with categorical privilege, or a confusion between the two. Just because a particular characteristic is privileged in one situation, it does not follow that such a characteristic is privileged in all situations. Being white may give someone privilege in a particular situation, but it does not follow that this characteristic will privilege someone in all situations. Which is why we should be specific when we're talking about what exactly does one mean by white privilege. If you mean categorical privilege, your claims probably aren't easy to justify and are arguably very unjustified because one can find a single instance where that characteristic doesn't lead to privilege. However, if you're talking about hypothetical privilege when you say white privilege in this particular case, then it's much easier to, through an experiment or a study, look at whether or not those outcomes are the case. And a single instance doesn't disprove it because we're talking about averages in that case, not a broad universal statement. So once again, this isn't saying one is right and one is wrong. This is saying that you need to be specific about what you mean when you use a term like white privilege or straight privilege or female privilege or male privilege, what have you. Categorical privilege, the claim that a particular characteristic provides positive or equal outcomes in all situations, seems impossible to prove, since we can't test all such situations, even when confined to the current time and the actual world. And it seems like an excessively broad claim to make in order to prove the points that most people that would make such a claim would be trying to prove. You don't need to prove that a particular privilege exists in all situations or that a particular characteristic provides privilege in all situations in order to make the argument for a particular hypothetical privilege in a certain situation. It seems possible to construct a situation, no matter how ridiculous, within the actual world at this time where it's not true for any characteristic, no matter how uncommon. This seems like an unjustifiable straw man position, though it doesn't mean that no one holds it. Furthermore, hypothetical privilege is all that one needs to make most points relating to the topic. You don't need to claim that being white provides better outcomes in all situations in order to claim that being white provides outcomes that are better when trying to buy a house, get a job, get into college, etc. Trying to defend categorical privilege is going to open someone up to a wide range of completely legitimate critiques when they can defend a much weaker version of the argument and still get their point across. They can defend the hypothetical claim that in this situation, this characteristic is a privilege. However, because people often oversimplify in their conversation and say, oh, white privilege, by being white, you are privileged in all situations. By oversimplifying that and not being specific of what they mean, people open themselves up to a range of very legitimate criticisms. So, I would say be very careful what exactly you mean when you say privilege, especially when it's not related to a situation. Another place that disagreements often arise relates to causality. Some people claim that a particular characteristic inherently causes the disparity in outcomes, while others claim that it's society's treatment of that characteristic which causes this disparity. As I have formulated it, privilege has nothing to do with causality and exists regardless of whether it arises from something inherent to that characteristic or simply a particular society's treatment of that characteristic. It does not matter if you believe that being able to see makes you have better outcomes when driving a car because you're able to avoid obstacles, or because cars and roads have been designed for people who can see, or if you don't believe in causality at all and you're a deep-seated skeptic about that. All privilege requires is the disparity in outcomes, not a causal link. On the more controversial end, you could believe that men are more likely to be homeless than women because they are more prone to alcoholism. There's something inherent to the characteristic of being a man which makes you more likely to be homeless. You could also believe that it's rather society's treatment of men which makes them more likely to be homeless, namely that women are more likely to have access to social services. Regardless of which of those claims you believe, you're still assenting to the general claim that in that situation, women have privilege in the situation of being homeless or not. Similarly, you might think that men are more likely to be promoted to leadership positions because they are naturally better leaders, or you might believe that we have been trained as a society to associate positive connotations to leadership qualities in men and negative connotations to the same leadership qualities in women. men are conceived of as strong or persevering, where when women do the same things, they're conceived of as bossy or uncaring. The point is, no matter which of those views you hold, your position on privilege shouldn't change. Your position on privilege relates only to the characteristic and the eventual outcomes, not to the mechanisms that lead from that characteristic to those outcomes. Defining privilege in this way, without requiring causality, that should be without requiring causality, makes the empirical claim easier to demonstrate, since even without deep skepticism, causality is difficult to demonstrate. Like I said, I'm skeptical of the empirical claims to start with, but even for dogmatists that hold you can demonstrate things like causality, there's really high standards to do that. Now, with this in mind, one might want to make a further distinction between just and unjust privilege. And this will be why there's so much debate around what causes a particular privilege. Some people may believe that if the inherent characteristic causes the privilege, that makes that privilege just, whereas if society's interpretation of that privilege causes that privilege, that makes it unjust. But there's a lot of difficulty in parsing that distinction, as we're going to get into here. But first, let's just broadly distinguish what we're talking about when we say just or unjust privilege. Many people believe that someone with a better work ethic deserves to get a promotion. Someone that works very, very hard deserves to get a promotion. In other words, having a better work ethic as the characteristic should privilege one in a situation of getting a promotion. However, there are other characteristics which we believe should not privilege you in terms of a promotion, such as your economical class, your wealth. Whether or not it is the case that having more wealth makes you more likely to get a promotion, most people don't think that someone being rich entitles them to a better chance at a better job. So, if it is the case that being wealthy makes you more likely to have a better job, many people would say that that's an unjust privilege that you have. Whereas many people would also say that it is a just privilege that you have if you have the characteristic of working very hard that you get a promotion. How exactly we pick out what a just or unjust privilege is very, very difficult and very contentious. Some of it relies on our ideas about the causal mechanisms that lead from a particular characteristic to a preferred outcome. Some of it just is cultural, and certain cultures may hold one way, certain cultures may hold it another way. So, here's some examples. There are some situations that many people agree on, but there are others where there is broad disagreement. Some people believe that historic disenfranchisement should mean that minority racial or ethnic groups should be given explicit privilege in college applications or government jobs. One can see this with both kind of tribal quotas that you saw in Rwanda in periods before the genocide, as well as within the affirmative action policies that you can see in college applications around the United States. Some may claim that this is an unjust privilege, while others claim that in fact it's simply balancing out existing unjust privileges for racial or ethnic groups previously in power. If you believe that there exists a particular privilege in a situation, and you believe that the existing privilege is unjust, you may try to impose another privilege to counteract it, or legislate a situation where no such privilege exists. While it is an interesting debate as to which privileges are just and which are not, this is definitely beyond the scope of this video. Though I encourage you to discuss it with these specific terms. What makes you think that a particular privilege is just or is unjust? It's not necessarily that we think privilege is bad. In many cases, we think privilege is a good thing. We think that people who work hard should get ahead, that should be a privilege. The question is not whether or not privilege is bad, but rather which privileges are just or justly earned and which ones are not. I'd encourage you to check out Harrison Bergeron, which is a wonderful short story by Kurt Vonnegut. I have a reading of it here on the channel, as well as a video discussing some of the issues brought up there. And it deals with some of these issues of which characteristics do we consider providing just privilege and which ones do we consider providing unjust privilege. Finally, there's a normative claim that someone with privilege in a particular situation has an obligation to quote-unquote check their privilege. The exact normative claim here is unclear, so we're going to look at a couple options and see whether they're sustainable. So one might take this to mean that if you have obtained a positive outcome in a particular situation, but also have a particular characteristic which makes such an outcome more likely, i.e. a privilege, you have a moral obligation to acknowledge the impact of that characteristic on the outcome. Frankly, I think this claim goes too far, as it places an unattainable epistemic burden on everyone. As a skeptic, I'm worried about asserting that we know anything, but this seems too much even for a dogmatist to claim. Being aware of all of the privileges we have, whether they're biological or behavioral or societal, which lead to a positive outcome, seems just frankly impossible. I'm skeptical that anyone knows my entire genome or what parts of it influence my success or failure. I'm equally skeptical that one could provide an exhaustive list of my social characteristics, let alone discern which are correlated with success in a particular endeavor. You might be able to pick out a couple which have been commonly mentioned in the literature, but if our strong moral claim is that you have to be aware of all of the privileges that you have, this seems not possible for people to do. I don't know how every single A or T or G or C in my genome affects my advantages or disadvantages in a particular situation, any more than I know how my appearance, the way that I look, the way that I speak, the way that I act, affects others' perception of me. So knowing every single privilege that one has seems just epistemically unsustainable. I doubt that I know anything, let alone this broad categorization of things that it would be required for someone to meet for every single situation in which they obtain a positive outcome. It seems too broad and untenable. But perhaps this is an unfair characterization of the mantra. A more charitable version that looks not to kind of a deontic, strong rule that one needs to follow, but rather to virtue ethics, might help provide us with a different frame to look at it. So we might argue that checking one's own privilege is simply a dimension of humility, or is a virtue in itself, or just a different way of describing the virtue of humility. We need to find a balance between acknowledging the success, which can be attributed to unjust privilege, to not be overly proud, and acknowledging the success which should be attributed to just privilege, to not be overly humble. The virtue lies somewhere in between thinking that you got where you are fully on your own and attributing everything to your demographics. So, in this formulation, when someone is saying to someone to check their privilege, they're not saying you need to follow this strict ethical norm or mantra or rule. Rather, they're saying that you're falling too far into the vice of pride by attributing an excess of your positive outcomes to just privilege, when in fact I think that at least some of those might be attributed to something we might consider unjust privilege. I think that this is both a more charitable formulation of checking your privilege as kind of a ethical mantra or norm or expectation, as well as being something that is epistemically possible. We can't be aware of all of the things that influence us. But of those things that we claim to be influencing us, we need to be conscious of how many we're attributing to our just privilege and how many to unjust privilege. So, once again, I understand this may be controversial. It also may be boring. No one may be left watching the video, but thank you for watching. Here are some takeaways. So I would argue that privilege is context dependent. Claims of categorical privilege are difficult to justify, often false, and are unnecessary to demonstrate that a particular hypothetical privilege exists, or to argue that that particular hypothetical privilege is unjust, as many people that are making these claims want to do. You don't need categorical privilege to make that claim. And trying to get that categorical privilege is going to open you up to so many other objections that it's not helpful. Privilege does not need causality. A characteristic can provide privilege regardless of whether it causes it directly or it's caused by the way society treats that characteristic. You may think that that has some relation to justice, but whether or not it's causal doesn't have bearing on whether or not that privilege exists. Privilege can be just or unjust. While many people agree that some types of privilege are just, hard work, skill, and so on, there are others where we don't agree as to whether a particular privilege is just or not. So privilege isn't always a bad thing. Privilege, as defined in this video, can in many situations be something good, be something positive, be something we view as earned or just. However, where the disagreement comes is in what situations do we think that privilege is unjust? And finally, privilege checking is best defined as humility, not a strong ethical rule or norm. Ethical claims around privilege checking, in my view, are best viewed as encouraging the virtue of humility, not as a deontic kind of ultimatum of you must be constantly aware of every single privilege and advantage that you have. Rather, they're saying that when you are talking about your success, make sure to find a balance between what amounts of your success are due to just privilege and what amounts of your success are due to unjust privilege. Whew! What do you think? Are you sold on my definition of privilege, or do you want to offer another? Is categorical privilege justifiable, or is the only privilege that we can demonstrate hypothetical? What makes a privilege just or unjust? Does it relate to causal links, or is it something else entirely? And should you be required to check your privilege? Is the kind of weaker version of checking your privilege related to virtue ethics that I offered something you would want to accept into your ethical framework? Is even that too strong and you'd want to go down even farther and say that checking your privilege at all is problematic? Would you go up a level and say, no, I was fine with the strong deontic rule of holding that you need to have knowledge and understanding of every single thing that has influenced any positive outcome? What do you think? I understand this video is controversial. I also understand that it's long and we're already posting a day late. So please offer your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org and stay skeptical, everybody.